By 1979 and the start of the Iran hostage crisis, the United States had long been involved in Iran. In fact, America had put the Shah in power. This made the Shah and the American government good friends, but the Shah's enemies would never forget the role the United States had so casually played in their nation. The Shah, once in power, set out to modernize Iran, and in his mind, that meant he also had to westernize it. This alienated and enraged many traditional Iranians. The Shah's and America's reputation was further hurt by Savak. Savak, created in 1957 by the Shah and the CIA working together, would become internationally famous for the brutality, cruelty, and macabre creativity of its torturers. By late 1978, mass protests had erupted against the Shah and westernization. The Shah fled the country on January 16, 1978. The Ayatollah Khomeini, a radical religious leader, returned to Iran on February 1st to cheering crowds and immediately became a dominant political force. On November 4th, 1979, a mob of Iranian university students swarmed over the walls of the American embassy in Tehran and took 60 Americans hostage. 52 were held for 444 days, sometimes being tortured, with their ordeal finally ending on January 20th, 1981. America and Iran had, and still have, extremely different ideas about how a country should be run, since America is a secular, democratic country and Iran is a theocracy. Iranians called America the Great Satan, and America thought Iran was run by crazy fundamentalists. Although the Iran hostage crisis was a terrible situation, both Iran and the United States were able to overcome their direct ideological conflicts and negotiate with each other to come to a peaceful diplomatic compromise, demonstrating that diplomacy is possible even between bitter enemies. Over the course of their 444-day ordeal, the 66 American hostages were frequently tormented both physically and psychologically by their captors. When the embassy fell, the staff and Marines were tied up and blindfolded and led out the front door into the crowd of students. William Galbagos, one of the embassy's Marine Guard, remembers, "The crowd around me were hissing, 'CIA!' It sounded like they were going, 'Sss!' The hostages were kept in the embassy buildings, usually in small groups with 24-hour guards. Hostages recounted being interrogated frequently by their captors. William J. Doherty, a CIA agent who was one of the hostages, was subjected to more than 100 hours of interrogation. He remained stalwart through all of it, determined not to reveal his position as an agent, only finding out months later that they had known he was CIA the whole time. Marine Sergeant Rocky Sickman recounted, "We went outside 7 times, 15 minutes total, in those 444 days. Hostages had their possessions stolen, their mail withheld from them, and frequent threats of violence should they try anything. Their captors also taunted them with cruel remarks, telling hostages awful things like that their mother had died or their wife had left them for another man. The prisoners were tied up almost all of the time and were forced to just sit around. After the failed rescue attempt, the hostages were split up and sent to various locations around Iran so that any further rescue attempts would be impossible. Despite these horrible conditions, the Iranians maintained the whole time that the hostages were their honored guests and that they were being treated well." Since the Iran hostage crisis, the U.S. and Iran have continually antagonized each other. For example, the United States broke off diplomatic relations with Iran because of the crisis, and the U.S. imposed sanctions on Iran. This began when President Jimmy Carter froze Iranian assets in American banks during the crisis, though Iran was able to access some of this money again following the Algiers Accords. The U.S. has periodically increased sanctions on Iran since.
In some ways, the sanctions and the fact that they date so far back tied our own hands in terms of our ability to further pressure Iran over its nuclear program.
After all, America cannot sanction something it has already sanctioned. In 1983, the American embassy in Beirut was bombed by Hezbollah, a group linked to Iran, killing 63 people and 17 Americans. The explosion reduced the embassy to a grotesque avalanche of concrete chunks, pieces of office furniture, and dead bodies. The fact that Iran supports Hezbollah means that Iran carried out those attacks by proxy. This has increased tensions between America and Iran. The fact that the second attack was on an American embassy added insult to injury in light of the crisis. The extremely different beliefs and values of Iran and the United States caused them to have terrible opinions of each other. In his "We Shall Confront the World with Our Ideology" speech, the Ayatollah Khomeini stated, "The will of Almighty God, may He be praised, decreed the release of this oppressed nation from the yoke of the tyranny and crimes of the satanical regime, and from the yoke of the domination of oppressive powers, especially the government of the world-devouring America, and to unfurl the banner of Islamic justice over our beloved country." Iran, at the time, was ruled by a Muslim theocracy. It was their belief that this was the best and most just way to rule a country. Khomeini saw America and the Shah as evil for not following strict Shia Islam, and for the crimes the Shah's government committed against the Iranian people. Common Iranians thought no better of the Shah or America, and the prevailing belief was that America was hypocritical for claiming to love freedom while also having supported the tyrannical Shah. This made Iranians hostile towards the United States, and without any desire to have pleasant diplomatic relations with the United States. While Iran is a theocracy essentially ruled by a supreme leader and guardian council, America is a democracy with freedom of religion guaranteed in the Constitution. Freedom of religion and voting are considered very important rights in America, and America often views countries like Iran that do not have these as dictatorial. After the hostages were taken, President Carter said,
"It's vital to the United States and to every other nation that the lives of diplomatic personnel and other citizens abroad be protected, and that we refuse to permit the use of terrorism and the seizure and the holding of hostages to impose political demands."
Americans thought of the Iranian actions as inexcusable and with no respect for international law. Anti-Iran demonstrations broke out, with many Iranian citizens in the U.S. being harassed. Many would tell people that they were Persian instead of saying that they were Iranian, as many Americans did not know that Persia and Iran were essentially the same. Americans were incredibly angry at the kidnapping of fellow American citizens and thought of the Iranian government as crazy fundamentalists, a prelude to current views on various countries and groups in that region. Despite these ideological conflicts, using a third party in Algiers, the US and Iran were able to resolve the crisis with a diplomatic compromise that satisfied both sides. After the death of the Shah in 1980, Iran's main demand, that the U.S. return the Shah to their country, was no longer possible. Additionally, the invasion of Iran by Iraq caused Iran to need weaponry, which could be provided in a deal with the United States. Communications with the U.S. were begun in secret in September 1980 by a relative of Khomeini, Sadegh Tabatabai. At that point, the main demands of the Iranian government were a formal apology from the U.S. for putting the Shah in power, and a promise never to interfere in Iranian politics and leadership again. It was eventually agreed that they would meet in Algiers that November, using Algerian diplomats as third-party intermediaries, since Iranians refused to speak to any Americans directly. The American diplomats were led by Deputy Secretary of State Warren Christopher, and the main Algerian mediator was Foreign Affairs Minister Mohammed Ben Yahia. The diplomacy took extra long since, according to Jimmy Carter, the Iranians, who spoke Persian, would only talk to Algerians, who spoke French. Any question or proposal of mine had to be translated twice as it went from Washington to Algiers to Tehran, and then the answered and counter-proposals had to come back to me over the same slow route. The negotiations may have been slow and difficult, but in the end they were successful, since every hostage was returned safely to America. The only casualties in the crisis were the 8 men sent on the failed rescue mission. No hostages died. "Every one of the 52 hostages is alive, well, and free," said Jimmy Carter in his announcement upon the release of the hostages. The crisis did have a somewhat happy ending because Carter's diplomatic approach did work in the end. Both sides were more reasonable than the other expected, reasonable enough to prevent deaths of hostages, showing that diplomacy and compromise can work even with a country viewed as an enemy. The most important lesson that can be drawn from the Iran hostage crisis is that even when countries are bitter enemies with vastly different beliefs, it is possible for them to negotiate towards a mutual agreement. Both sides were reasonable enough to see that diplomacy would produce the best outcome for the both of them. After the crisis was resolved, the hatred between the two countries did not disappear, with America still viewed as evil by a majority of Iranians, and Iran seen as the enemy by a large part of the U.S. population.
I certainly think anti-Iranian sentiment still exists. I think that the resistance against even, lifting some of the sanctions and having the Iranian nuclear deal, was tainted by the hostage crisis. That's still very. There was just knee-jerk response. These are evil people, and we can't trust them.
The Iran nuclear deal showed that even after decades of despising each other, they could again come peacefully to a deal. This ability to negotiate with enemies is something that is desperately needed today. With North Korea an ever-increasing threat to the United States, the government chooses to threaten fire and fury instead of negotiating. Even as North and South Korea reopen their communication hotline, our leaders jeopardize these vital talks as opposed to simply letting them occur or even supporting them.